It is back to school time for many, and parents as well as students are hoping shopping for all the essentials. But with inflation, buying basics like backpacks and binders can feel like an extravagance. Our senior education reporter, Deanna Sumanak-Johnson, is looking into this for us.
Even those things that can feel like basics can be harder and harder to budget for when everything else is so expensive. Food, gas, cost of living, rent, mortgages have gone up dramatically. And we are seeing those things reflected in how much money or how little money people are spending on back to school expenses. For example, the Retail Council of Canada has surveyed more than 9,000 Canadians on their back to school shopping habits. They found that 3.4% more Canadians than last year are spending less than $50 on back to school. So that's really the bare minimum for those new things that are needed. Also, people in Deloitte looked at shopping habits in the States, and people there used to typically spend around $700 US for those back to school supplies. That was last year. This year, that has gone down by about 10%. So a significant drop in how much people are budgeting or expecting to spend. In the US, usually those shopping patterns tend to be quite similar in Canada as well. One of the things we're finding is that people are shopping more in brick and mortar stores. We know last year people still were getting out of the pandemic. There was a bit of anxiety about going into physical stores, so lots of shopping was done online. People are now heading back to physical stores, but what seems to be happening, again, this is as per Retail Council of Canada, is they're finding that people who shop well ahead of time, so good planners, you know, who shop in, let's say, July for September start of school, there's fewer and fewer of those. That number has definitely dropped from 40-something% of shoppers last year to just over 30 this year. And there could be several reasons for that. One of them is, of course, that people are waiting for perhaps that next paycheck or for those good sales that tend to be closer to the actual start of the school year. But definitely we're seeing some indications that parents are finding it harder and harder to buy those back to school supplies. I was working on a very similar story around just this time last year because, of course, the inflation already started happening and we were sort of just out of the pandemic. It was the first school year that was expected to be, you know, fully back in class. And I visited one family around this time last year where the mom said, you know, can you reuse this backpack? Is there really a need to buy you a new one? What about this binder? That looks fine. I mean, there's no reason that everything has to be new. And that's one of the things that financial advisors and people who are sort of helping out people on budgeting for these kinds of expenses are saying. You don't have to buy everything new. Other things we're seeing is increasingly reliance on secondhand clothing, secondhand backpacks. We went to one place in Cape Breton. It was a public library where they actually had a clothing swap, a clothing exchange, where anybody could come in and just pick up whatever piece of clothing they wanted for their child of any age. And here's what one of the organizers had to say about how the stigma of that, of getting secondhand clothing for your children, really isn't there quite in the same ways that it used to be.
I think there's been a kind of a slow shift away from that stigma, and I think events like this help because everybody participates. And also thrifting has become really cool, especially for teenagers. So I think it's all part of that ethos of people wanting to be more sustainable and more kind of eco-friendly. And so I think clothing swaps are a huge part of that transition.
And she said it is becoming really, thrifting is becoming very cool with the teenagers. So that's definitely affected attitudes towards that and taken away some of that, frankly, the shame that some people feel. I will tell you, as a reporter, finding people who are willing to talk about their finances and especially about something like providing those back to school essentials for their children can still be really hard because people still feel some sense of that stigma and shame talking about how hard it is. But it definitely does seem to be harder for so many people with the buck stretched so tight on other living expenses.